Hello and welcome to another episode of the Power Hour with Dare to Scale. Today we are continuing the conversations, as you know, on efficient operations and particularly business processes, something that is so critical and yet frequently overlooked. And guess what? Today we have a master of the field joining us as a guest, and we will bring him on stage and introduce him in just a couple of minutes. To remind you, first of all, that Dare to Scale, the Power Hour by Dare to Scale, is of course brought to you by two essential products out there which talk about Dare to Scale and what we do. And one of them is, of course, the book. The book is out there. If you are based in the UAE, it's available in most of the bookstores out there. And do you know what? Hey, this is a great victory that we can share. It is available now in Dubai duty free. So if you're flying in and out of the country, find it over there, pick it up. Tell us what you think. Tell us what your biggest takeaways from the book, and we'll continue that conversation, of course, on your mentor at daretoscale.com. The other is the podcast. If you haven't subscribed, please go subscribe to our podcast, which is called the Dare to Scale Show. It is available, of course, on all the podcast platforms. And over there, we bring you more predominantly some great stories of entrepreneurs who have gone through that entire journey and can look back and say, those were the massive successes. And there's some inspiring stories out there, along with some business tools, tips on scaling up. So come join that conversation as well on the Dare to Scale Show. Evan, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Such a pleasure to have you in, and like Washa says, efficient business operations this is part 2, in fact. We spoke about this 2 weeks ago. And the good news is, like Washa said, today we have a wonderful guest with us, and that is Shaun Nicholls. Shaun has a vast experience, and it covers a multitude of countries, a multitude of cultures. And you know, he brings strong technical and operational experience and expertise to what he does and when he's working with people.
Yeah,
he's got a very strong track record of delivering on the strategic level, the business level, the profitability level, and essentially the biggest piece of that is business transformation. He's a strong
digital transformation as well.
Absolutely. And he's a very strong proponent of lean management processes. So without further ado, let's bring Shaun into the room.
Shaun, welcome to the show. The Power Hour is indeed incredibly happy that someone like you has joined us to talk about a very dry and usually avoided subject like business processes. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much for your time. Excited to be here. You touched on it. It is a bit of a dry topic, but I think it's a very fundamental one. Really excited to the conversation.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's you know, riding a bicycle is one of those things that is sort of boring in nature. It's the scenery that changes. So it's one of those sort of things, you know, you make it as exciting as you want it to be. Shaun, welcome. And tell us a little bit about your experience across, you know, a multitude of jurisdictions and sort of how that's led you to where you are now.
Yeah, so I started off my career in pure IT. So that's where a lot of my technical expertise and experience comes from, working for the likes of Compact Computers and a couple of others back in the day. I think the one big part of who I am as an individual is I'm a very curious person. I like to learn, I like to get involved, and it leads me often into exploring, chatting, and working into different areas. So that led into changes in my career. So I moved into FMCG and retail specifically, still within the technology field, but that's when you start to engage. You start to understand what's important in those businesses. What are the heartbeats of that organization? I think the other thing is that I worked for a lot of multinationals, and often multinationals set specific standards from a global scale or a different part of the world, and they may not necessarily understand how that impacts or what it needs to change in a local environment. And then that led to my change as well. So because of interaction, extroverted, love to be involved with people, I wanted to be able to make an impact in an organization. I left IT and I jumped into supply chain management and logistics. And that was wonderful for me because now I'm sitting in the heartbeat of an FMCG company. I'm interacting with factories locally, internationally. I'm working with sales colleagues, I'm working financial colleagues. I'm needing to manage a third-party logistics provider. And so the scope of what I had access to was large. I didn't necessarily come from a logistics background with perhaps some common misnomers or perhaps common ways of working. So I asked very different questions. And I did things differently. I started to converse in a different manner. I ensured that I understood my colleagues. So I went with them to buyers' meetings, back doors of retail stores. And at the same time, I forced them to come back into my world. What does a distribution center look like? Why does order size matter? What does returns do to the logistics kind of value chain? And because of that, I then got headhunted by another company where they were specifically looking for technical skills as well as logistics supply chain skills for a big multinational called SGS based in Switzerland. And they had a multitude of kinds of projects, and two kind of areas that I really enjoyed was going to facilitate trade. So how do you help developing countries specifically to trade better? How do you get them to become more efficient? How do you take them from an area that they perhaps don't have the skills, the processes, the capital, and jump them forward to become competitive within the regional global economy? So in Mozambique, we went and we started a project to take over customs for the entire country. And that was vast and huge. You had stakeholders from the finance minister to your head of revenue authority to the DG of customs, and you needed to build offices from scratch. You needed to build data centers from scratch. You had to be creative that if I wanted to go and dig up a road to lay fiber optic cables just to ensure the connectivity, I needed to do that. The returns was phenomenal in terms of learning for the team, learning for me, but the returns for your customer. The ability to now get goods going in and out of their ports. How do they clear things for themselves in 3 days instead of 3 weeks? How do they ensure they get in their returns in terms of their fees back? So that's one aspect. I also went into Africa, into African rainforests, dealing with traceability. How do you trace natural hardwoods, mahoganies, ebonies, and those kind of how do you make sure it's sustainable? How do you make sure that it is legitimate or legal timber, that it has gone through the chain of custody, that the duties and taxes have been paid for, and that the end customers, being European countries, US, companies want to buy the wood so that they know that it is of legal nature. So touched on technology, processes, project management, working again with multitude of stakeholders around that. And because these two projects and the needing to understand and go and see and be on the ground, so to speak, it led me into strategic transformation or continuous improvement. There's so many different buzzwords that are used that links very strongly to business processes. And I needed to do that across the whole of the African continent, as well as parts of Europe. You want to standardize the quality and the service that you provide into your customers. There should be no difference as to where you are, whether you are in Cameroon, Liberia, or Switzerland itself. And that led to various other roles in terms of even managing a full P&L. Moving on to customer type facing roles and leading commercial within a cash management company, working on behalf of the Reserve Bank and banks as my customers, and having to deliver not only the P&L, but now come up with new revenue streams and what needs to change in the organization to do that. It was very inwardly focused. How do they become outwardly focused? It touches business processes. And then jumping from there into a startup environment. Startup is very different. A lot more relaxed in lots of ways, a lot more flexible, can move a lot quicker. You don't have that red tape bureaucracy that you perhaps have in corporate organizations. But perhaps the business processes are even more important in that state. How do I now become more professional? How am I able to do multiple projects at the same time that leads to more success, partnerships, funding, and repeatability, so that we can scale? How do you start to get the lift?
I love it.
moved here.
Yeah, no, and
Nice.
it's a fascinating journey, and like we got in the ticker tape down the bottom there, there's the sort of broad strokes of sort of why, what, and how processes are important. And you touched on the entrepreneurs, the sort of SME space, obviously the very large, even governmental kind of space as well, where there's so many moving parts. Tell us. When we sort of we touched on this yesterday when we had a chat, we were talking initially about the sort of the why, and then the sort of the big pieces within the journey of process mapping. You mentioned PPT. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think often when making a change or environment or a business, it's perhaps looked at in a singular level. PPT is a triangle that talks around what are the changes to the people. So how do we need to impact our people? Do we need to train them? Are they clear on their roles and responsibilities? Where do they touch between departments? Then it touches on technology. So what tools are we currently using? What systems are we currently using? What documentation needs to come out or go in? And then it's the process itself. So what are the processes across the organization that helps to deliver the PowerNet? And they cannot operate independently. They are intricately linked. And it's important that when you go down a journey that you're involving multiple areas around the people, the process, and the transformation with a heavy leg around communication, change management to be successful.
Wow. So people, process, technology. Great.
I'm going to put out a question for all our listeners today. First of all, thank you for joining us. In the Power Hour by Dare to Scale, we stream live on LinkedIn and YouTube. So here's a question for you. And send in your thoughts, use the comments box, and tell us, if you were to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on the focus that you put. I'm not even saying how strong are they, just your focus on the business processes in your business, which you either lead or you're part of a team. How would you put that score, and what would you ideally like it to be? So just putting it out there, keep typing in as we continue this discussion with Shaun Nicholls. So Shaun, as Evan said earlier, we're going to be addressing this particular topic in 3 broad strokes. Why business processes? And the second one was, where or what is that? So what is the translation of the strategy into business operations or processes? And the third one is how to. So let's start with the why. You did talk about why you went into this particular line, and you said something which was amazing, and it was music to our ears, which is standardizing a customer experience, standardizing how you do things. And this is very rarely talked about, and I want to touch on this, is standardizing the experience for your team as well. So you don't go into that firefighting mode where everybody's scrambling to do things. So let's first talk about why business process. So over to you.
Yeah, so I think that's a critical question you need to ask yourself, and we did touch on it briefly already, but it has to start with the customer. And a business exists because of the customer. There's a need, whether it be a product or service, some kind of transaction, there's something of value that they see that they're prepared to pay for. So that's the very first reason why you need to do that. Linked to that, and you did talk about it in terms of your team members as well. So you've got external customers and you've got internal customers. I think ensuring that there are clear roles and responsibilities, understanding the parts that each team member and function plays is of critical nature. And with clear business processes, it actually takes away things like friction. You touched on firefighting. And I think waste is important. It's quite surprising how much time we can waste in business process that doesn't add value to us as a team internally or to the customer out there as well. And profitability, without a doubt. How do you improve your profitability? How do you reduce the waste and obviously reduce the costs internally? I think the continuous mindset is important, the continuous improvement. How do you continuously look at where you are, what are you doing right, where you
Yeah.
perhaps have areas of improvement, and what do you need to change. There's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with being able to have to pivot or needing to improve, or suddenly there's a disruption in the market. Everybody talks about disruption, especially after COVID. So I think that's really, really important as well.
Yeah.
And then knowledge. Knowledge is really, really important. Knowledge transfer. Often knowledge sits in a person's head, a team member's head. And when that person moves, leaves, whatever the case may be, you lose in a huge amount of intellectual property at the same time. And when you bring somebody new on, how do you bring that person up to speed? How do they get to understand your business promptly, quickly? So the knowledge sharing part is really, really important for me as well.
Oh yeah. And I'm gonna excuse me, I'm gonna read out a couple of comments that are coming through. Remember, when you post comments, it'll take us a couple of minutes for it to translate into the platform, the streaming platform. So bear with us. Candace says the current score is 4 out of 10, and would like it to be 7 out of 10. That's brilliant. And this is what even is the first step towards identifying where we are. So great one. Kenneth says, having a mapped out process that is benchmarked and supports the intended experience. Yes, totally true. Candace also says, there's a question there. How do you simplify processes as sometimes multiple processes become complex? That is absolutely true. And we'll be addressing that in the how-to section.
Correct.
Keep those questions coming in. Evan, over to you for continuing the conversation on still keeping on why.
Yeah, and I mean, in sort of my observations, my background is hospitality, a little bit of private equity, theme parks. A lot of those sort of spaces are about efficiency and removing waste and that sort of stuff. And oftentimes we can sometimes get lost in the detail, or sometimes we're so high up in the clouds that we overlook important parts within the processes. Oftentimes I think of, I don't know, there's a comment, be franchise ready, have everything working such that it's all 100% perfect. And we talked about this yesterday where, look at McDonald's, right? Every one of their processes is absolutely streamlined. No, anybody can step into that. They know what they're doing and that sort of thing. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the what, I think. We can't ignore the people in that process, but the process itself, and having that knowledge, like you were saying, Shaun, that knowledge available, the IP, if you will, all of that sort of locked in, if you will, so it doesn't get lost, is terribly, terribly important. But in terms of the why, like there's a good question, like how do you simplify these things, which almost begs the question, why is it even important? So what have you found in your journey, Shaun?
I think it starts at what's the intention on the strategy of the company. Do they have a strategy? What are they trying to deliver upon? Where they're wanting to go in the future? And sometimes that done over a 3 or 5 year period, because strategy should not have to change much. But I think it's distilling that strategy down into the bite-sized pieces of work, down into the organization that says this is how we're going to deliver on that strategy. And this is the touch points within the organization and how it needs to hand off around that. Interesting enough, that the point that Kenneth has made as well is the why of the benchmarking is also important. So when you specify or draw out your business processes to deliver on that strategy, you need to put in some kind of measurements or benchmark as to where you are and where you want to go, so that you can understand whether that's working or not as well. So for me, it starts with the strategy, where we're trying to go, what does that mean? Sometimes you get people that are very good at the blue sky thinking or the high level view, but they don't know how to distill that or bring that down into now what does it actually mean and how do we deliver upon it. And that's where your business processes come into it as well, in terms of that. And I think if you really start to document your pieces of work, it goes back to saying, is the strategy correct? And are we delivering the service that we want to deliver, or the product?
Yeah, totally loving it. And that brings me to some of the keywords that came out of our conversation when we were prepping for today. And that I've made a note of these. It's for why is it essential? One of the key reasons is also for your business to be agile, to be flexible. Can you expand on this a little bit for us, please?
Yeah. So I think if you've got a standard set of processes, it drives understanding within the organization. It understands the repeatability, and it also allows you to very quickly pick up where there's something going wrong. So it goes back to the measurability as well. So if there's something going wrong, you know what to change quickly. Right, so that brings in your agility. So you can change quickly, you can adapt to the changes of your customers. Perhaps your demand has gone up, and it brings that flexibility. I think if you are dealing with it as a kind of lackadaisical kind of approach, or perhaps bit more unstructured, then you cannot adjust very quickly, or you cannot deal with the demand. And flow is so important in an organization. Right, if you think about a river, it starts somewhere and it ends somewhere, but it's continuously flowing all the time. It's got ways and means of getting past things, and that flow is important. What you do not want in an organization is massive change. It causes that kind of up and down change that takes away a flow or constant. That's why the business processes and being very clear on that improves that and allows that agility and flexibility when there needs to be a change, whether it's market change or customer change.
Yeah, and also leading to being able to repeat what you're doing. So making your delivery repeatable, eventually leading to building that strong fundamentals within the company for eventually scaling up the business. So especially true for small to mid-sized businesses.
Yeah. So scale in a small to mid-sized business is always important, and especially in the startup world nowadays, they think that the hockey stick kind of effect or the ability to scale is going to deliver the results as quickly as possible. However, if you don't have that consistency in terms of what you're offering, and you rather get that trend going in the right direction, it can lead to, again, uptick very quickly, but then a very quick drop as well. So you want to ensure, yes, the trend's going up. Can you do multiple things at the same time? So the processes allows that to do it, and you want that trend versus that big up and down movement in terms of customers coming on board.
Totally true. I'm loving this, because just this morning, Evan and I were having a conversation along these lines, and it's almost become a buzzword about rapid growth or scale quickly, all leading to that hockey stick scale almost. And yet, is it about that, or is it about being able to sustain that growth, building that very strong foundation? So whatever you're doing that is moving the needle is actually built on a very strong foundation. So thank you for talking about this.
Totally. I mean, one of the key things, I just want to jump in here, one of the key things we talk about in the book is about organic growth, and things like your cash flows supporting organic growth, which means that your operations, everything need to work within that sort of framework, and you're sustaining in the long term and for the long term sort of what you're doing. It's not growth just for growth's sake. It's doing it, so it will last.
Oh yeah, totally.
Absolutely.
I'm loving the conversation. And Candice has asked another question. Who? Oh, that's brilliant, because we have the why, the what, and the how to, and the who almost becomes part of that how to. Who should own the process mapping? Should it be at an executive level or a functional level? Brilliant question.
Great question.
And and we will absolutely address that. And Kenneth continues the conversation as well. We will. Brilliant points that have been made over here. And before we continue, Shaun, is it a question that you would like to put out to all our listeners, particularly on LinkedIn? There's a good conversation happening over there. If you were to ask them a question for just where they're at, what would it be?
I think the first question is kind of linked to the other one in terms of you asking where do you think you rate yourselves in terms of a score. So my first question is, how much time do you spend as an entrepreneur or functional head or person involved in business on reviewing your processes, looking at continuous improvement, and understanding what's working, what's not working. That would be my first question.
Nice. I love it. Keep those comments
I'd-
coming
I'd-
in, and
I'd
definitely answer this question, please.
I'd add a caveat to that is how much time, definitely, and how frequently, I think, is also important.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Oh, very nice. Very nice. So let's move on to the second part of this conversation. So how would you define that translation from strategy to the operations, so efficient operations? As today's topic is all about efficient operations, it doesn't stand on its own. No element in your business stands independently. It is very much interrelated. So, Shaun, over to you for going a little bit in depth into that translation of strategy to a business process.
Yeah. Okay, so let's try and take a simple example. Let's say, for example, the strategy of the company is that I want to be able to deliver a seamless, wonderful customer experience in a restaurant that not only delivers delight to the customer, but it allows us to also give back in terms of the community, in terms of giving back, right? I mean, I know it's a simple example, very high level, but a business process, very simplistically, is a set of actions that is required to deliver on that. So it's delivered the product or service that's been promised from a strategy perspective, that's been defined. And it's literally saying our end goal is that the customer needs to receive a product or service. And I'm going to work backwards to identify what are those steps that are value adding, and sometimes they can be non-value adding to the customer. What is waste? Because you do get waste sometimes in the processes, but it's working backwards to ultimately deliver on that for your customer. And you can think of it from an internal customer perspective as well. So sometimes companies have boards, or you've got shareholders or directors. The same thing applies, right? So if they need to be able to understand where we are in terms of how much revenue we're bringing in, what are our total costs, how much inventory have we created, it's the same thing. It's saying that's what we need to understand. So what are the steps going backwards from the different functional heads? What are the reporting methods or systems we need to use, tools that ultimately delivers that informational data points internally as well, that helps to explain as to where we're going. So that's a business process. I think besides identifying the steps and to get to the value add to your end customer, I think it also identifies where the handoffs are. So what does each person or each function do? What are the responsibilities? And how does that work, right? Often that's a big problem. And sometimes you hear an organization, I'm not sure what to do next, or that's not my job, or where does that need to go? So business processes will definitely touch on the roles, responsibilities as well. And I think it's that flow piece again I spoke about earlier, is when it's all plugged together to understand that value stream holistically. So you're going to have a high level business process, and then you're going to have the bite-sized chunks. That for me, simplistically, the business process is to deliver on the strategy.
And the key thing to note here is for the end customer, they don't care what process you've gone through. They just want the outcome. And it's quite interesting because Kenneth has actually put a very interesting comment in here where processes can serve the customer and or the organization. But ultimately, I mean, again, in my opinion, it's about the customer ultimately, because that's your reason to be. Otherwise, there's no point. But some processes, it's quite a long comment, but it can contribute directly to the customer. And sometimes they need to be there. And you're right that over time, Shaun, it's a comment that you'd made, some processes can become superfluous. They don't get picked up on the radar, and it's common, where processes can end up in silos. And that's the critical thing that you were saying, the handover, right?
Yes, and connected to that, I want to jump in just very quickly to particularly that last sentence, and it's almost like Kenneth's actually reading my notes, because that's that. And there's a question that he's put there, and I wanted to pick up on that. How would you define waste? So along the same lines as the processes that we develop processes that are superfluous and that usually don't get picked up, along the same lines, how would you define waste? Because a lot of people don't actually pick that up.
Yeah, it's surprisingly that they don't. However, when we get into the how a little bit later, we'll talk around what that looks like and how that can help identify it. And you'd be surprised how quickly that you can identify those areas of waste. So a couple of things that could be seen as waste is overproduction. So are you doing too much that doesn't add value? Right, so it could be too much work, perhaps creating too many documents, perhaps too many steps in the process, perhaps you're making too much stock inventory. It could be waste as well, besides a cost to yourself and your business. So that's one area. Things like transportation or waiting. So how do you move information, data, or if in a manufacturing environment, how do you move those steps through, and how much time is spent in terms of physically moving, physically walking, the waiting aspect, the transportation, touch time. So how much time do I need to spend to actually go through it? How much time does the finance department have to spend credit checking and putting on a customer, as an example, or supplier into the system? That'll be one. Things like motion. So if you're in an office space, or if it's specifically operational, so there's going to be movement. So have you thought about the design of your movement? Have you put together some kind of diagram that says, oh, I start here, I need to come out here, what does that look like? Have you gone and done a time and motion kind of study as well to do that? Because that is a form of waste. Defect work is another form of waste. So is there something that you've done that just is completely broken, completely defect, that now means you have to go redo it, creates rework in the system? That would be a form of waste as well. You would want to obviously reduce the defects to as little as possible. And I think the other thing is that if you create too much stress around demand and it's more of a push versus a pull, it creates a stress within the system. It creates a stress within your people as well. And it does link back to the responsibilities and handoffs, because if those are not clear, it becomes stressful. So your stress situation is a waste within your business process too. So those are a couple examples of the waste that I would look at or try to identify in the business process.
And these are some great examples. Shaun, I want to dig into this just a little bit more. How would this work in a professional services scenario, for example? Because there are lots of people out there, particularly delivering service as a product, and this question comes up more often than not.
Yeah, I think from a professional services perspective, again, understanding the total process, you need to be very slick between where does it start, so where does the request come from? What do we do with that request? How does it need to be allocated to teams or team members? And then delivery very quickly around that. Professional services needs to be that kind of efficient slickness, right? People don't want to wait. They don't want to be sitting around. So your transportation / waiting and your touch points, those would be your three biggest areas of waste that you would need to really dig into. I think your processing part. So how quickly do we acknowledge the incoming request? How does it flow into relevant documentation? And it depends on the service you're delivering. Perhaps you're doing testing. How quickly can you do those tests and make sure that you deliver them on time, consistently, every time? Is there documentation that needs to go with it? Is there a certificate that needs to be with it? So making sure that that gets back to the customer. And then invoicing. I mean, simple things like creating an invoice that is 100% accurate. Those would be forms of waste, specifically in professional services. Your customer should not need to worry about any of that. I want a service, it's done quickly and quality every single time. There's no difference.
So the interesting thing, Shaun, within that waste sort of space, I think the distinction between sort of direct cost and hidden cost is where it becomes very interesting. And a lot of the hidden cost is lost in time.
Yep.
Because you can't 100% put your finger on it. it goes unnoticed. And like you were saying, just sometimes with the handoff, I mean, one department might be working 100% well, and everything gets sort of stacked up against the door that the next department hasn't quite got the stuff yet. No, they're just not managing, and there's a lot of time wasted there. And that's that time motion kind of space that you talk about. I mean, hidden cost is, and I mean, sometimes it's a sunk cost. It's like admin. It's a necessary evil, but you can be more efficient in that. And it's that hidden cost that definitely needs to be looked at. So that's part of the what. Part of the how. We'll get to that. Okay.
Well, I'm just muting in between because Evan highlighted that there is a slight echo. So, Evan, thank you for that. I'll mute myself, and I'm very much here, part of the conversation. So again, Kenneth, thank you for being such an engaged listener. This is brilliant. Some of the points that you're making are superb. And the last comment that you posted, and it's there for everybody to read, but I come back to the last part, which is why Candice's earlier question is interesting, and we are going to go straight into that. It is about the how. And thank you, everybody, for joining in. This is a brilliant conversation going on with Shaun Nicholls on that critical aspect of your business, which are business processes. So, Shaun, shall we move on to then now how to and who is accountable, who owns that? And is it a particular department or a particular team, or is this a collective process? There are lots of areas we can dig into in that how-to process. So let's begin. Sleeves rolled up, everyone. Let's go on to now the actual doing part of this conversation. So, Shaun, over to you.
Thank you. I think the very first point I would like to make, and it's the question I asked earlier, is how much time has been invested in this? So for any organization, I'll get to the roles now and who should own it, but you have to make time for this. It's similar to strategy work as well. If you don't take the time to put yourself in a room, think things differently, learn, upskill, whatever the case may be, you're not going to see the results, and it's going to be quite back to normal. It's easy to get back into normal things, get back into what you're used to, or repetitive behavior. So you need to make the time, and it's going to be an iterative process. You're not going to do this once. You're not going to do this twice. It should be a mindset that you bring into the organization. And it's similar to things like quality or even safety or risk management. It's a mindset. So you need to have the mindset, and you need to invest in the time, 100%. The next point is specifically around who should own it. I do think it is a collective. I don't think it can be done from an individual or a specific role with an organization. I think you add value in terms of the creativity and the understanding and picking up the pain points quite quickly, the more people you involve. Now, I'm also cognizant that you can't take everybody out the workplace for a specific day or time. So, there's ways and means of setting certain champions within a business unit. You could have a specific function set up. So in bigger organizations, they will actually spend time and money in creating a continuous improvement or a business process improvement kind of department that are obviously targeted and given clear measurables of what they want to do within the organization. And from a leadership perspective, it definitely starts at the top. If your leaders, your CEOs, COOs, founders, whatever you want to call them, if they're not invested into this, they do not see the real benefit, it's not going to go anywhere. So it's collective, but it has to start at the top, and you need to be spending time with it as well. And assigning the champions is really important. It's amazing how champions or specific stakeholders or super users in the case of systems, you'd be surprised in how many of that does not exist in a lot of companies nowadays too.
Yeah.
We talk about this in the book as well. The tone is set from the top. That drive, that starting point needs to be from the executive team, from the founder, if it's still a founder-led business, and that's where the energy actually and the initiative starts from. That keeps the team going and driving forward. So, Shaun, while it's a collective, what are your thoughts on who remains accountable for this now remaining a live document? Or shall we address this in a little bit on after we deal with now how to? What is the first steps? Where do you even start with this?
I think you need to start off with identifying and specifying your product or service, right? So what is the value that you're delivering out to the market? What is your customer prepared to pay for? It's always important to keep that front of mind. It's always important to keep your customer front of mind because it keeps everybody in the same direction. So I would definitely start there. Then it comes to the activities, and I spoke about it earlier. So what is a business process? It's a set of activities or steps of value. And sometimes it's non-value adding because of perhaps regulatory framework or compliance you need to deal with, as an example. But you need to map out what are those activities that you're doing that provides that value to the customer. It starts with the end goal in mind, and it's around working backwards. If you sit in with an organization, you're saying, well, I don't know where to start, pretty big, or I'm sitting with 6 different departments, it would be good to understand is there a pain point that you can already see? So are you receiving feedback from your customers to say, I'm not happy about quality, it's taking too long? What is your customer saying? Or is there another area of difficulty that you can see in your P&Ls or your accounting documents or reporting that says, we've got a problem. We don't know what it is, but there's a problem here. And that can sometimes start the conversation in the correct area in terms of which business process to dig into first. Once you've identified that first process, I think it's important to be very clear with the team coming into the room, and you can do this remotely with COVID nowadays, is that the business process that we've got in place or may not have in place doesn't mean that it's not good or it's not bad, but we want to improve. We are here to improve because we want to make our customers delighted, or we are losing money. We want to fix this because this is the benefit of the company and us as an organization as a whole. So I think the mindset going into it is really, really important. Right, so we've identified we need to look at, for example, operations is taking too long to get a product or service out to our customer. So what does that mean? Let's map that process. That's the simplest, easiest way to do it. I like to use these, a whole bunch of Post-its or sticky notes on a bunch of flip-chart paper all around the room. And the reason why it's good to do it this way is because, one, a lot of us are visual animals, and sometimes when you've stuck something up on a wall and you step back, you can see it very, very quickly. So mapping out a process is really important, and I think it's important as well. It's not what you think the process is, but it is the actual process. Sometimes if you've got a person coming from another department to be part of this workshop to bring in a different dimension, different thinking or creativity, you should get up and go and have a look, right? So get up, go into that operational area, into the warehouse or whatever it is that you're busy creating, into perhaps a cooking area, kitchen, and go and actually just observe. Go and have a look to see what's going on. Take photos. Photos are really, really important around that. And then it gets into the questions of the why. So as you're busy looking, interacting with the people in that process, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And often multiple questions of why gets to more the root cause of what the action is or why that action is taking place. Bringing all that data back into the room then allows you to go and actually map it out. There's different parts that I think you need to map within a process, and it always starts with what are the steps, so what is the step of value that we're creating. So I receive a request from a customer. I want a product or I want a service. Okay, what do we do with that? Do we now enter that into a system? Do we write it down? Do we put it into Excel? Do we then deliver a document out of that that goes back to the customer? So it's important to know what's going in, what's coming out. How much time does that take? Can we put a time to it? Do we need to go and measure it through a time and motion study, which is actually relatively easy to do? After that first step, it's saying, okay, so does that create inventory? Does it create waiting time? What is step 2? Is there a delay between the 2 steps? Who's involved? And mapping out the entire process over a period of time, and very clearly, and then you start to use other sticky notes to say, between step 3 and 4, there's a pain point. My system's too slow, or I'm waiting for my department down the road from me because they haven't delivered it to me, or the customer's suddenly shouting because their expectation of the timeline is too short to what is actually taking place. And that's what we refer to the waste that I spoke about earlier. And you can very clearly, pink post-its stick out like a mile away, stick it up to map it out. So the mapping, the data points, the systems in and out, what documentation, what inventory is being created, the touch times, queue times, waiting times, all really important to map it out really clearly, really diligently, and based on what you've seen and not what you think you've seen is where I would go. And you can associate different pain points along the way. So not only the pain points of the customers, but the pain points internally, because those pain points are going to cause friction. And then it's right. So, okay, so we know what this is. We've got it mapped out. Can we analyze it? Do we need to double check the data? Do we need to check the calculations? Often, gets into points that finance, it takes you 3 days to do this. No, it doesn't. Well, here's what it is. So show me how it does. So you need to sometimes validate and check that. And then once you've mapped that as is, you can say, well, what can we do now? So are there steps that we can reduce? How do we fix some of those pain points? Is there a system that can come in that will make it quicker? And do it iteratively. So start off with 1 or 2 small steps, go and do it, come back a week later. And I think it's really important to not only document that, and sometimes you can leave that up on the walls, very visible. People walk around and say, what's going on there? Or what does this mean? And it prompts those questions, it prompts different creativity, and it really starts the processing, because people are often too busy to think this through.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
So you always have not so much a lot to say, but it's the what next. So for what purpose are we doing X? And really peeling those onion layers to drill down to what is absolutely necessary and to keep things moving forward. There's a fantastic comment. There's a couple of comments about ownership and sort of top-down approaches and that sort of thing. But there's a very good comment here from Darren. Hi, Darren. How are you doing? So comparing large teams to teams in small businesses, typically the founder is the one who's driving that process and the improvement conversation. So how do you recommend that drive to own be transitioned without having the ability to create a continuous improvement committee?
I think it's a fantastic question. Definitely something to delve into, and specifically in a startup environment, come across that quite a lot. The first thing is often the co-founder or the founder is not only the owner of the business, but the business concept or idea is their baby, right? So generally speaking, when you've got a baby, you're going to be protective over the baby. You want to look after it. You want to feel like you need to be owning it. And I think the one critical part that a leader or co-founder CEO needs to learn very quickly and really adjust to is being able to delegate and allowing your staff that work for you to dig into the details and to do their role. The role of a co-founder or CEO is often the strategic direction in a startup environment. It's going to be funding, for example, and you need to be able to push back in the right way that allows you to do your work. And I'd love to give an example on this because I've come across this frequently. So in the startup that I was working in the fintech. We provided the ability of digital wallets and payment services in informal sector across Africa, specifically informal, focusing on the merchants because the merchants looked after a very small community, and we were working with large organizations like banks and FMCG companies that often do not know what's happening on the ground. And we had started a project in Zambia, and it had lots of visibility because of our two partners being the banks and the FMCG company. And I was the person on the ground. I was the COO. So I was there personally going around to the merchants and needing to make this happen, get the devices into the hands, make sure that the people understood how to use it, quick, efficient, and obviously they wanted to see results quickly. There was an expectation. So I had a call from the CEO. CEO happened to be in Uganda at the time at a conference, and he happened to have one of the partners there next to him asking questions because they were seeing certain things on day 2 of this implementation. And he phoned me in a bit of a panic, and he said, "We need to do this. It's not happening fast enough." And I just politely said to the CEO and the founder, I said, "Let me go dig into what's going on. I'm on the ground. My team's on the ground. Let me go get the facts, and I'll come back to you." No, we need to jump on this. And he was getting quite hysterical about it. I said, "Look, I've got this experience. You've hired me for this role. I will get back to you. Give me an hour. I will phone you back. Don't worry. Let me go do it." And what I did is I went back and I gave myself not only some space and breathing room, but I went and I spoke to the teams. And in operations specifically, or being on the ground, it's not about if things will go wrong, it's about when things will go wrong, right? So it was going through speaking to the teams, speaking to the different merchants, understanding that there was a slight delay because power, right? So in informal sectors, they don't have power. They don't have electricity connection. And there's load shedding in African countries. And they needed to rely on a car battery that was flat, or there was no solar available. And so there was a slight delay, but the team were aware of it. There was lots of communication going around. There was WhatsApp messages going backwards and forwards. And, in a couple of hours, we'd be able to recoup the lost time and you'll start to see the changes. Able to get that information and able to go back to the CEO and say, right, here's the information, here's the facts, this is what we're doing about it, here's when you see the results. And it was fascinating because he didn't give him a sense of comfort at that time, but a week later, and after coming back from that trip, he was able to say, I now value you even more so because you did not allow the emotions to take over. You said, I've got this. You went and got the facts, you gave me the feedback and frequent feedback, and you then were able to show the results and, more importantly, regain the composure and the trust in our partners. So I know that's a bit of a long kind of example, and it may not give that specific answer, but I think it shows the what happens, the dynamics within organizations is there needs to be the clear roles and responsibilities and understand where that needs to happen. And if we need to give frequent communication or put some kind of measures in place that gives that level of comfort to the founder, then that is in place. And to their end, we don't need to have a specific committee, but there should be an assigned executive in this example that is able to do it, that is able to work within the teams, get it done and ensure the feedback's happening back. I think the communication loop is of a critical importance. When a founder or an executive doesn't know what's going on, that's when they worry the most, or they're not getting the information quick enough.
That's actually brilliant, and thank you for sharing that example, because it's quite common actually in founder-led businesses. And just another shout out to Candice and Dhiren for that continuous engagement. Candice, thank you. There's some absolutely brilliant points that you're making. What you said earlier, Kenneth remarked on the mindset. Totally true, isn't it? It's just so up our alley. We're going to continue this conversation, and I know the Power Hour usually is set for an hour, but oh my God, this has been it continues to be a brilliant conversation. So we will run over just a few minutes, but please bear with us and keep sending your comments, keep sending your thoughts, because this is a critical element. We can't say this enough, a critical element in your business. So there is something that there was a comment that came through and which reflects on exactly what you were saying here. Kenneth says that Candice makes a good point. The key to making this work is having some team own it and a mindset for others to support instead of get in the way of other teams. Can you expand on this a little bit, please? Because it doesn't matter whether it's a large corporate organization or if it's a smaller one. This is actually very, very true, and we come across this quite a bit.
Yeah, no, it is critical. Let me put it in a different way, perhaps. sometimes I refer to myself within an organization. So whether I'm working in a consulting manner or in the organization in an effective role, is I'm often the conduit through an organization. There needs to be a conduit or single voice of customer, even though a lot of people probably disagree and say that everybody owns the customer, and that's partially agreeable. However, there needs to be that coordination, the understanding and flow of information. So in that fintech startup, again, I was that conduit, because not only was I having to implement and make it happen on the ground, but I often had those original conversations, the commercial conversations with the customers and the merchants that would be using the technology in the field. And there needed to be an alignment. So I needed to make sure that I would be that conduit to bring the same message all the way through the organization. So whether it's a finance, say this is how the contract needs to work, this is the commercials, whether it be now my team being the implementation team to say this is the project, this is the things we need to be aware of, these are the key dates, etc., etc. Then speaking to procurement to say to deliver on this, we need X, Y, and Z by these dates. And then very importantly, within a tech environment is there's a development team sitting in the background that often do not have the visibility of being on the ground or understanding the customer, or perhaps don't understand that a simple 1 to 3 push of a button and very boring kind of layout is more than sufficient for what is needed on the ground. So you need that conduit, and you need that ability to, with the assigned, I suppose, executive kind of sponsorship, to say that there's a person that's doing that coordination right the way through, and there's only one version of what needs to be delivered, and there's one version of what the customer wants, and this is how it's going to work. And it's to celebrate that as well. So it's having often daily stand-up type calls, that conversation to understand, make people understand why, because questions will pop up. And I think it's important that not only ensuring the conduency happens, but sharing and answering the whys. Developers have it, why? Why do I have to do this? Why can't I release this now? And you need to be able to answer those questions. If you spend the time answering the questions, they will understand better. They may not stop asking the questions or may not fully understand, but they will do it. And then I think involving the different champions I spoke about earlier, assigning champions per department. And often what we used to do is take a developer out into the African countries and took them through the process as well. So I think that being the single point, having that sponsorship, having the communication, being able to answer the whys, being able to then celebrate the successes afterwards as well is really, really important. The conduency, really critical in my mind.
Oh, yes, celebrate that success. Absolutely. And along those lines, I saw a note from Tressica to say asking the why questions can help you build better processes, and right from the mapping stage. So some really, really good comments coming through. Ajay has joined the conversation and says, even as you said, even the knowledge is critical in the particular service or on the product that we sell. Totally. Everything contributes towards building that strength in the business processes. Evan, you were saying?
Yeah, Shaun, I love the idea, or the notion of an advocate. So you have somebody who is the customer's champion inside the business, because getting customer feedback is one thing, but if it's just being presented broadly speaking to the company, it means nothing unless somebody is actually the inbox for that, if you will, and then sharing that and directing that through the company. Totally love it. I do have a question on some of the how. Now, you mentioned there's processes, and just putting to one side the contingency planning, like when things fail, of course they will. What is the contingency? That's just another process that goes into that whole mapping. So what happens when, power fails? A different sort of thing, a different process sort of kicks in then. But what I want to understand is, you mentioned measuring and the KPIs. Now, we talk a lot in the book and in our sort of coaching about forward-looking or leading indicators and lagging indicators. Sometimes it's difficult to sort of choose which is correct. How do you know you've got the right KPI, and how do you know you're measuring the right thing?
Very good question. And sometimes that can be a bit of a process of going through it. I think if you've mapped your process and you start to understand what is measurable, then you can start to get a better view of what that KPI should be. Again, I do think it starts from the customer. So what is the customer looking for? So what are your measurements you're going to define for the customer around that, and that consistency on that? The measurabilities needs to be consistent too. You can't do it once and forget about it. You can't do a customer experience kind of engagement with your customer and then nothing happens, right? They'll get upset in terms of the lack of feedback, or perhaps not moving forward. So understanding what are outward-facing KPIs, what are inward-facing KPIs, and how do they dovetail, because they will dovetail. Not all of them, but a lot of them will. And making sure that you reviewing those on a continuous basis. I think you need to keep them relatively small. I wouldn't go to too many. It creates no real value to the organization as a whole. And then it begs to the question to your teams is, what's more important? And how do I look at this? And I think the consistency of KPIs across your processes are also important. So we touched on the handoffs. How does it go from this person to that person, or this department? Those KPIs need to be interwoven. You do not want to have siloed processes and siloed KPIs. The measurabilities needs to be across the value chain that ultimately leads to that satisfaction, delight of your customer.
I love it. Okay. And again, it's really important. It reminds me of one of the concepts we talk about in the book, and that's Pearson's law. So Pearson's law is essentially what you measure, or at least what you pay attention on, what you measure gets improved.
Yeah.
But the important thing here is what you measure and report back improves exponentially. So it's where you're having that dialogue and you're actually looking at the measurements that matter, and using that as yardstick to know how you're actually going. And there's normally one sort of KPI. I mean, in the hotel game, when I was there, it's your average room rate or your occupancy rate.
Yeah.
It's as a very quick measurement of where you are and how that translates to everything else, like how many people you have working for the day and all those sort of things. Just all come down to sort of one sort of KPI. So, like you say, it's identifying what it is and then what actually matters.
Absolutely. And coming back to the business processes, if you know which steps add value, you'll know what those measures are during that as well.
Yeah. No,
nice.
Completely.
Again, some brilliant comments coming through. Kenneth, you brought in Scrum. I love it. How have we never talked before? We need to connect. But it's brilliant.
Totally.
Absolutely loving this conversation. And yes, and I want to touch on what Kenneth has said, and something that you said earlier, Shaun, is about, so Kenneth says how many companies use a customer as a collaborator instead of an end user. I want to put in another sort of aspect to this. How many companies or how many founder-led businesses separate themselves from the business and have someone who is a voice of the business? What does the business require today, rather than what does the founder require something to happen in the business? So there are two ways to look at this, and really getting that objective look on what the strategy is mapped out to be, and how can this now translate to benefit the business directly, so that it then benefits all the collaborators. And why only stop at a customer? Because when you're building a business, it's a community that you're building. It's the customers are part of the community. So are your service providers, people who feed,
Yes.
or rather you use as service providers to deliver your service. So, and as well as your internal customers, which is your team. So there are several collaborators, and totally right. Why only look at the customer as an end user? This is eventually benefiting every single person who's associated with that business, isn't it?
I cannot agree more. One of the big things in the world nowadays is circular economy, which they often refer to sustainability or sustainable type companies, but it's not. I mean, it touches exactly on what you said, Washa, is that we need to involve as many of the moving parts across your business, from your suppliers, partners, to your customers, to your internal staff, to shareholders or funders as well, and understand those business processes and what is important, what's to measure, and be very clear and specific around it as well. Not to add layers of complexity, but to have a total view that adds value at each step.
I want to add a little picture to this, just by way of analogy. So I play golf, not particularly well, but I play golf. And it's interesting when you know, in golfing circles, you know, you drive for show, putt for dough, fine. It's always in the short game, yeah. And what you think is going on in your head is not necessarily what you are actually doing, right? So, like Wes was saying, it's that external sort of view. So you get somebody to come in and video or whatever it is. So while you're doing your swing, you can see all the things that you're doing wrong. Right. So what you think you're doing is not what's actually happening. And that's how you get the customer and or the rest of the sort of collaboration sort of pieces together, is observing what it is and actually making it better.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, that's critical. That's that get up and go and see, right? Coming back and bringing it and seeing it.
Management by wandering around.
Absolutely. And then it drives the consistency. We should have a separate chat on golf.
Yeah.
Hey,
Totally.
this has been a phenomenal conversation, and I think, Shaun, another episode sometime in the near future is totally on the cards, because this is a topic that we can keep digging, and it just gets richer as we keep peeling those onion layers.
Okay.
And first of all, thank you so much for such a brilliant, not just a conversation, but really throwing some light on this very critical element of scaling your business. Thank you to everybody else who has joined in today. What an engaging audience you have been. We love conversations like this, and this is why we bring you the Power Hour. It's not really about putting out a specific theory or a coaching scenario. It really is a place where we pick up a topic and just go deep in it, and we all walk away with so many immediate tips and takeaways, and that's an opportunity for us to bring in people like Shaun and have this brilliant hour that takes us through to over the next 2 weeks, and we come back. Shaun, first of all, thank you again. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. You're very generous in sharing your time and your experience with us today.
Yep.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Wash. It's been wonderful, and like you said, the collaboration and intercession, I suppose, with the team members and the questions have been fantastic. So, a great session, and a lot richer for it. Thank you.
Yeah,
it is indeed.
Before we sign off, Shaun, there were a couple of tools that we never actually got to. What we will do is post those in the, I suppose, in the comments, right? Do you want to just mention some of those tools that people can use that if they want to start working on their processes right now?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I always advocate the flip charts and the posters. It's a quick, easy, inexpensive way to start. However, there are some tools online. Software as a service is a big thing nowadays, and it's inexpensive, really speaking. Miro is a good whiteboarding kind of tool that allows that kind of posters, moving things around, multiple collaborators. You can have multiple people in at the same time, so you can see the changes as you're busy conversing, and even perhaps you go away and you process after. You can do that. Stormboard is another one. You've also got collaboration tools that goes into tasks or project management or building project plans out, which is things like Asana. It's a common tool out there, and Mural. So there's a bunch out there, but often it's about just the doing part first and not overthinking it. And it doesn't need to be perfect.
You just need to do it.
That's true.
Exactly.
That is absolutely true. And yes, again, lots of thanks coming through in the comments. Thank you guys for just being a brilliant audience. I can't thank you enough, because it's people like you who make an hour like this just go by in a flash. This has been a brilliant conversation, and stay tuned, because not only is the Power Hour returning in 2 weeks' time, so we do this every other Wednesday, but there are great guests coming your way, and you never know, Shaun is going to appear back on our screens very, very soon. But really, thank you very much for being a brilliant audience. Love Miro says, Candace, yes. Yes, very nice. Again, we will see you in 2 weeks' time. Evan, what is the date? I keep saying 2 weeks
24th.
every time we sign off, and I really need to give a date. 24th.
24th, yeah.
Yes, 24th. Wednesday, 24th is when we will be back with another brilliant topic. Keep sending us the topics that you want to address in the Power Hour, in all of future episodes. Send in that email to yourmentor@darescale.com, and we will bring that topic of discussion in this hour. So on that note, we will sign off for today, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everybody. Take care. Be safe,
Shaun,
be well.
stay here,
Take
and
care.
we can just continue this conversation just for a couple of minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Sure.
See you.
Bye-bye.